My name is Mira Toscan, and for 11 years I made my living with my hands inside dead ships. That is not a figure of speech. Salvage diving on a derelict is nothing like a recruitment reel. All clean suits and glowing readouts. It is dark, cold in a way that gets into your teeth, and you go in through a hull breach with a torch on your wrist and your bare palm pressed flat against every plate you pass. Because the suit gloves are too thick to feel the difference between a ship that is only quiet and a ship that is still, somewhere, listening. My father taught me that. Feel the hull before you read the hull. Machines lie about metal. Your hand doesn't. The Aurelane had been sitting in the Kessendrift boneyard for as long as anyone in the salvage guild could remember. 40 kilometers of drifting hulls out past the old Corvassa shipping lane, ships that had died of engine failure or war or simple abandonment, left to turn slow circles around each other in the dark, waiting for crews like mine to take whatever was left worth taking. Most of the boneyard had been picked clean twice over. But the Aurelane was different, and every diver who'd worked her knew it, even if none of us said it out loud. You learn the shape of a boneyard the way you learn the shape of a town you grew up in. The Aurelane sat at the far edge of the field, further out than most crews bothered going, and there was a story about her every guild hand heard sooner or later, usually over drinks after a bad shift. 6 crews, 6 clean sweeps, none coming back with more than stripped conduit and a bad feeling they couldn't name. Guild command had downgraded her on the charts twice, and both times some fool crew went out anyway, chasing the rumor that a ship that big had to be hiding something the others missed. My father used to say a hull remembers who fixed it. He meant it the plain way. A plate patched carelessly fails again in the same spot, and a plate patched with care holds long after the hands that patched it are gone. He ran freighter repair out of a leased bay in the Corvassa system for 30 years, patching hulls too old and cheap for a proper yard, and taught me to read metal before I could hold a torch steady. Feel the hull before you read the hull, he'd say, guiding my palm against cold plate with his hand over mine. The sensors tell you what the metal's doing. Your hand tells you what it's about to do. He never called it anything more than a trade. It kept food on our table when fancier work didn't. She was a generation hulk, old design, older than most of us had ever seen intact, built to carry a colony crew across a gap of decades, back before fold drives made that kind of voyage unnecessary. 3 kilometers of dead hull, her colony decks long stripped of anything a first wave of scavengers could carry, her drive core cold longer than my grandmother had been alive. 6 separate crews had gone through her in 30 years. Everyone came back with the same report. Whatever was left in the Aurelane wasn't worth the air it took to breathe while you looked for it. I went anyway. My guild contract was up for renewal in a month, my numbers were thin, and a hull that big had to have something left that 6 lazy crews had missed. My crew was small. Denny ran the tether line and readouts from our shuttle, parked off the Aurelane's flank like a gnat next to a whale. Oscar and I went in through the old cargo breach on deck 4, where the hull had buckled during her final approach to wherever she'd been going, a trip nobody ever finished. The breach let in enough ambient light from the drift field beyond that we killed our torches to save charge, working that way for 6 hours, crawling deck to deck, finding nothing but stripped conduit and the kind of silence that has weight to it, like water. Oscar had been diving with me 2 years by then, long enough we didn't need to talk much inside a hull, its own kind of trust. We moved the way you move in a place dead a long time, slow, checking handholds before we put weight on them, because 80 years of drift stress can turn a solid-looking bracket into scrap the second you lean on it. Deck 4 gave us empty conduit runs stripped bare by whichever crew came first. Deck 3 was worse, lighting fixtures torn out and sold for parts. Walls scored with tool marks from crews who'd all reached the conclusion we were slowly arriving at ourselves, that the Aurelane, for all her size, was just an old dead thing with nothing left to give. We talked about turning back around hour 5. My knees ached the way they do after too long crawling in a pressure suit, but something kept me moving deeper instead of toward the breach, and I've never explained that part any better than the rest of it. Call it stubbornness. Call it the instinct that makes you check one more plate on a hull you've already cleared, because something about the last one felt wrong even though the sensor said it was fine. It was on the 7th hour, 3 decks down, that I found the keel access. I want to be honest about what happened, because I have told this story exactly once before, to a guild inquiry board that did not believe me, and I am not interested in dressing it up now. I was not looking for anything. I was tired, my knees aching from 6 hours of crawling, and I put my palm flat against the keel plate the way I put it against every plate on every dead ship I have worked, because that is simply what you do. You feel the hull before you read the hull. I was not expecting an answer. Nobody expects an answer from a ship dead 80 years. The plate was warm. I want you to understand that this should not be possible. A derelict hull in deep drift holds the temperature of the void around it, give or take a few degrees from whatever light leaks through the field. It does not run warm under your palm unless something inside it is generating heat, and nothing generates heat inside a ship with a cold drive core unless that ship is not as dead as everyone has told you it is. I called it in to Denny. He told me I was reading my own suit heater wrong. I told him to check the ambient sensor on my glove, and when he did, he went quiet in a way I had never heard him go quiet before. Oscar felt it too. He put his hand where mine had been and pulled it back like he'd touched a stove. We should have left then. Everything after this point happened because I did not leave, and I have had a long time to think about whether that was courage or just stubbornness wearing courage's coat. What I did instead was press my palm flat against the plate again and hold it there, the way you'd hold still for something wild that had wandered close enough to touch, not wanting to spook it and not sure yet whether you were the one in danger. The warmth spread. Not fast, nothing about what happened in the Aurelane that day was fast, but steady, moving out from under my hand along the seam of the plate like something waking up one joint at a time. And somewhere below us, deep in a part of the ship no salvage crew had ever mapped because the old schematics marked it as solid ballast, something shifted. Denny's voice in my ear was not steady anymore. He said the whole ship had lit up on his scanner, deck by deck, moving up from the keel like a fever spreading through a body. He said he didn't know what to tell me except that whatever I'd just done, the Aurelane knew about it. I have relived the next 20 minutes more times than I can count, and I still don't have better words for it than the ones I gave the inquiry board. The ship woke up around us. Not violently. Nothing lunged, nothing screamed. No alarm klaxon dragged up out of 80 years of silence to tell us to run. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. Because quiet meant it was thinking. Lights I had never seen function on a boneyard ship bled on in the corridor, dim and amber, like the ship was rubbing sleep out of its own eyes. The glow crawling deck to deck deeper into the hull, the same direction we'd need to go to find its source. The deck under our boots hummed at a frequency low enough to feel in the bones of your feet before you heard it. Denny's voice cracked twice trying to raise guild command on the emergency channel, and both times he got nothing but dead static. Oscar wanted to run. I don't blame him, and neither does he anymore, since he tells the story to anyone who'll listen at the guild hall, leaving out the part where he was the one shaking. He grabbed my arm and said we should fall back to the breach while we had a clear line to it, and under any other circumstance I'd have agreed without a second thought. That is the first rule of hull diving. You do not stay inside a ship behaving like it isn't dead. But something in me, I still can't explain this, was certain whatever was happening was not a threat. It felt less like waking a sleeping predator, and more like watching someone open their eyes after searching for a face in the dark for a long time, and finally finding it. I told Oscar to give me 10 more minutes. He gave me 20. Because whatever he saw on my face convinced him faster than anything I could have said. We found the source 3 decks further down, in a chamber the old schematics had never mapped at all. It was not cargo. For one absurd second, kneeling there with my torch back on and my hands shaking worse than Oscar's, I thought I was looking at a very elaborate crate. It was humanoid in shape, though larger than any human, built into the keel itself rather than standing free of it, as though the ship's spine had grown around a figure rather than a figure placed inside a ship. Its surface was a dark alloy I didn't recognize, seamed with lines of the same amber light that had bled through the corridors above, brightening now, slow and deliberate, tracing up what I can only describe as its arms, its shoulders, the long plane of what might have been a face if a face could be made of metal and old purpose. It was not looking at Oscar. It was not looking at Denny, 3 decks up in the shuttle, frantically trying to raise guild command on a channel that wasn't answering. It turned, and I use that word carefully, because nothing about the movement looked mechanical. It looked considered, like a person turning to answer when their name is called. And it looked at me. I have read every account of first contact and ancient tech discovery I could find since that day, trying to find someone who described this feeling. None come close. It is not fear, though there was fear in it. It is the bottomless sensation of being seen by something that has waited to see you for longer than your species has kept written records, and finding that it was not disappointed. It spoke. I don't know how else to describe the sound except to say that it did not come from a speaker, and it did not come from the air. It came from the hull itself, from every plate and seam of the Aurelane at once, as though the whole ship had become a throat. It said my hand was the one it had been built to feel for. I asked it what it meant, because that is what you do when something asleep for 80 years tells you it was waiting for exactly you. 3 decks down in a ship nobody living had ever named. It told me, slow, in words that came easier the longer it used them, as though relearning a language it hadn't spoken since before I was born. It told me it was a warden corps, built into every generation hulk of the old colony fleets. Its purpose never navigation or defense, whatever 6 salvage crews before me had assumed while stripping its ship to the bone. Its purpose was to recognize the touch of a wayfinder, one of the old keel menders who traveled with the colony ships and repaired their hulls by hand, in the dark, in the cold. Because in the earliest days of the long voyages, no machine was precise enough to feel a stress fracture the way a human palm could. The wayfinders read a hull the way a doctor reads a pulse, telling with nothing but a bare hand against cold metal whether a plate was failing before any sensor could confirm it. Because the voyages were so long and the wardens so few, each warden corps had been built to know its wayfinder's touch specifically. Not a species, not a role, but a signature, a particular pattern of calluses and pressure and care, so that across decades of silence it would never mistake one hand for another. It said the colony fleets had trained wayfinders the slow way, apprentice to master, the same trade passed hand to hand for generations before a single one of them ever left port. A wayfinder learned to feel the difference between a hull that was tired and a hull that was failing the way another person learns to hear the difference between a friend's ordinary silence and a friend's troubled one, not from a manual, but from years of paying close attention to something they'd come to care about keeping alive. The warden corps answered that devotion in kind, built to wait for the hand trained to read them, because the fleet's engineers understood something later ages of automated diagnostics forgot. No sensor cared whether the ship survived the way a person did who'd spent years learning her by touch. The Aurelane's wayfinder had died before the ship reached anywhere. The colony records, what few the warden could still access, did not say how, only that the ship went dark soon after, its warden left to keep faith with a hand that would never come back. Until, by whatever thread carries a trade down through generations that forgot its name, that same signature turned up again, 80 years later, at the end of my own arm. I asked how that was possible. I am not the descendant of anyone who ever set foot on a generation hulk. My father taught me hull work on scrap freighters in the Corvassa system, the same way his father taught him, because it was cheap, honest work that put food on the table when nothing fancier would. Nobody in my family ever called it wayfinding. We just called it knowing your hands. The warden told me that was exactly the point. The skill hadn't survived because anyone remembered its name or its worth. It had survived the only way anything survives, 80 years of being unwanted, quietly, passed hand to hand by people who needed it to eat, who never thought what they carried was anything more than a trade too old-fashioned for the machines to bother replacing. Nobody preserved it on purpose. It simply refused to die, the way useful things always find a way to, long after anyone in a position to notice has stopped looking. Then it said the words I have not been able to put down since, the words I gave the inquiry board and watched them write off as pressure sickness or hallucination, the words I am giving you now exactly as I heard them, because I promised myself I would never soften them for anyone's comfort, including my own. It said, hers was the hand we waited for. Not mine, hers. Spoken the way you'd read a name off an old manifest, formal and certain, as though it had said those words to itself in the dark for 80 years, rehearsing them for the moment it would finally speak them to the person they were about. I did not have an answer for that. I still don't, beyond standing there with my palm pressed to a hull that was, for the first time in most of a century, no longer merely dead. Oscar tells people I cried. I don't remember that, and I've let him have it, because I think he needed the story to have a moment that made human sense to him. The guild took the Aurelane away from us within the week, too valuable a find for one small crew to keep, and I understood that even as it stung. There are teams out there now, real research crews with real funding, trying to map what the ship remembers, trying to understand how many other warden corps sit quiet in how many other boneyards. I still work salvage. My numbers are better now, for reasons that have nothing to do with scrap credits. But most nights I think less about what I found in that ship than what it told me. That the thing in my hands, the thing my father gave me because it was the only inheritance he had, was never small. It was only unclaimed. I called my father the night after the inquiry board finished with me. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him what the warden said about the wayfinders, about a trade passed down so quietly, nobody who carried it forward knew its name. He was quiet a long time, then told me his own father had said the same thing to him. A hull remembers who fixed it. He'd always thought it was just a saying. He asked, careful, whether his father had known what he was passing down, or whether it traveled that far by accident, unnamed the whole way. I told him I didn't know. I still don't. Some inheritances arrive so quietly nobody along the line ever sees the whole shape of what they carried, only their own small piece, handed on because it seemed worth keeping. I do not know how many other wayfinders are out there, running bare palms over hulls they think are only quiet, waiting for someone to call them by their old name, I know I was not the first to touch that keel plate. 6 crews touched it before me and felt nothing back, because none touched it the way I did, without thinking. The way you'd check on someone you already trusted was there. I have gone back to the Aurelane twice since, both times on the research crew's invitation. The plate is warm before my hand even reaches it now, like it's listening for my step 3 decks up. The warden speaks less than it did that first day. It says it is conserving something, though it won't say what. But it always says the same 3 words when I arrive. Quiet. The way you'd greet someone you'd stopped being afraid wouldn't come back. I have stopped trying to explain any of it to people who weren't there. Some things you don't explain. You just keep showing up, palm flat against the cold plate, and let the ship remember you back.